Welcome to Clearing the Haze. I'm your host, Chuck Marting, and today we have a guest with us, Mr. Keith Graves. Keith is a retired police officer in DRE, and he'll talk to you a little bit about that and some of his background and training. But we felt it was very productive at this point to have an expert in that could talk to us about some other things in the workplace that we need to look for. We've talked about drugs, we talked about workplace policies and procedures, but there's other things that individuals that work in our workplaces can get to, and they can come into the workplace, and if you're not trained to recognize and identify these things or even know that they're out there, it's going to be really hard for you to be able to know that that is what is going on. Just from our experience, we did have one company that had guys that were on probation, and they knew that this company was testing for marijuana. They were coming to work high every day, and we were doing the drug testing, and nothing would come up. So we asked if we could go ahead and test for spice. We had to educate them on what spice was, and I'm not going to steal from Keith's thunder. He's going to talk about that here in just a minute. But we did a rapid screen with that, and lo and behold, these guys were coming back with spice. And the reason they chose to do that is they knew that their employer was not testing for that. They could still get high or have a high that was similar to what they were wanting, and so they just substituted. But with that, I'm going to have Keith do a quick introduction for himself, and then we'll go right into our interview today with Keith on talking about synthetic drugs, and we're going to talk a little bit about fentanyl as well. So Keith, thanks for being here, my brother.
Hey, thanks, Chuck. I appreciate
Good to
it.
have you here.
Oh, it's nice to be here. It's funny you mentioned people, in that group taking spice. I mentor veterans up in Idaho that are going through drug court,
Oh,
and
wow.
so my one of my mentorees, he's an Iraq War veteran, has a methamphetamine problem. We're in a group setting. There's about 20 people there, and the drug counselor asked, "Who's used spice?" Every single person raised their hands except for two.
Wow.
And when asked why, every one of them said, because I'm on probation
Holy
across the
cow.
board. I was shocked at how many it was. I mean, you know, uh, you mentioned I'm a drug recognition expert. Well, I was a cop for 29 years, as you know,
Yeah.
and I would run across people all the time out on the street that are on probation and parole, or were working for a company that did drug testing. And I would see that they're under the influence, but they didn't present like a regular, what you would expect for whatever drug you're looking for. And a lot of people are taking these other synthetic drugs to avoid their drug test. That's one of the main reasons why they're doing it. In fact, there's some studies coming out now to show that that's why people are switching over to synthetic drugs. You'll still have all the drugs that the DOT tests for, right? You'll still always have those drugs, but the synthetic drugs, we're coming out with one new synthetic drug every week is coming new to the market. How can you keep up with that?
Well, yeah.
It,
What's the attraction for an employee to do that? I think you hit a little bit on that, is obviously the drug testing, but um, traditionally we're hearing a lot of stuff about people with prescription drugs and abusing drugs for prescriptions. And a lot of times we have employers that don't stay on top of that as well because, well, hey, they just got it from your doctor, so it must be all right. Not realizing that people use and abuse that as well and become addicted to painkillers. I mean, we're seeing that with
Mhm.
OxyContin and oxycodone and all
Yeah.
these opiates. But in your experience with what you've been doing, especially with being a DRE and stuff, what do you think is the attraction for these guys, or why would they choose to go to that route?
Because you can still get high and not go to jail and not lose your job that you've worked so hard to get. That's the main reason.
That's it.
The other thing, it's easy too. Sorry. So let's look at the drugs that people use to avoid drug testing, right? So we talked about spice, right? So if you're a marijuana user and your company tests for marijuana, well, you can switch out and now use, we call it spice, that's a slang term, but a synthetic cannabinoid. And these have strange names like JWH 200 or AB Fubinaca. It's just, there's several hundred different formulations. These formulations, though, affect cannabinoid receptor sites in the brain. So by saying that they're a synthetic cannabinoid, I kind of disagree with it because when you evaluate somebody under the influence, you're actually looking at drug impairment. They don't look like they're under the influence of cannabis. They actually look like they're under the influence of a stimulant and a hallucinogen combined, is what it looks like to me. sometimes more like a dissociative anesthetic, like how you would imagine like PCP or something like that. Um, so when I evaluate them and I'm looking at drug impairment, they do not look like they're under the influence of cannabis. But people are going to take those drugs because they think that it's going to be a good replacement for marijuana. But in reality, it's 100 times as potent as THC. So when you look at marijuana, it causes anxiety and paranoia. Okay, well, if it's low THC, your paranoia and your anxiety isn't that great. But multiply that anxiety and that paranoia by 100. What would that paranoia and anxiety look like when you have them in front of you? It would be exponential, right? Let's say I'm using coke or meth. We had one guy, he was on parole, and he was actually working for a big trucking company too. Uh, the cops would stop him. He always looked high. They would arrest him for being under the influence of a drug, which they thought was meth, and he'd come up negative every time. So when I heard the cops stop and my officers stop him, I rolled over there and I evaluated him, and he did look exactly like he was under the influence of, a stimulant like meth or cocaine or something like that. But he came back negative, so I resubmitted to the lab, and it turns out he was doing bath salts. And bath salts are actually called synthetic cathinones. They could be, like ephedrine, MDPV, or, alpha PVP, all these weird chemical names, right? And it turns out that's what he was using. And that's why he was coming up clean all the time, because he was using those drugs that people aren't testing for. And the other thing too is, when think about it, if I go, let's use like I'm from California. I worked in the San Francisco Bay Area. I can go to Oakland and go buy some cocaine, but I risk getting robbed. I risk, getting hurt. I risk getting arrested. I could be getting arrested by the cops that are selling fake drugs to get people, or, all these different things that can happen, right? Or I can go online, go on the dark net. You can even open it go look on the open web. Most of you are probably sitting at your computer right now. Just go do a Google search for mephedrone, MEPHEDRONE, mephedrone for sale, and look at all the people selling on the open web. And you can just order it and have it sent to your house, and you don't have to worry about getting robbed. You don't have to worry about getting ripped off. You don't have to worry about getting shot. You don't have to worry about all these other issues that might come up when you go and buy drugs. So the internet's the new street corner dealer. So it's easier to go buy those drugs, right?
Yep.
And, it doesn't make sense. Like DOT, I hate how they do how they pick their drugs for drug testing. They are, like, as an example, they still test for PCP. Yes, I know people use PCP, okay? But the 70s want their PCP test back. There's nobody using PCP like that anymore. And why are we wasting money testing people for that, right? The people that use PCP don't have a job for the most part, and aren't going to get tested in the workplace. And even still, when you look at like, when you look at like methamphetamine, Chuck, you were a DRE, when you arrest somebody, you say they're under the influence of a stimulant, they give them a drug test, and they'll come back positive for meth or coke or whatever stimulant you pick. Well, what's the cutoff level now for methamphetamine? I think it's like 500 nanograms.
Yeah,
Is that what it is?
I believe so.
500 nanograms per milliliter. But when I arrest people for being for DUI,
It's actually
DUI
1,000 nanograms.
I thought they lowered it to 500. Anyways,
It might be.
yeah. So let's say it was even 500, which is lower than that 1,000, right?
Yeah.
I would get people on quantitative testing that would come back positive at 100 nanograms per milliliter that I arrested for DUI because I felt they were unsafe to drive a motor vehicle.
Yeah.
But they would have passed their workplace drug testing.
See, that's insane, and that's one of the big reasons why I've got you on here is that I think a lot of times with employers, they're becoming frustrated because they're seeing exactly what you're saying, and that we saw as police officers. You'd pull somebody over, you start looking at them, and you're automatically thinking, okay, I've got methamphetamine, some sort of a stimulant here that I'm dealing with. You go through the whole thing, you send in the test results, and it comes back negative.
Yeah.
And this guy.
But you're not wrong.
Yeah, you're not wrong. It's just they didn't test for the right drug.
Exactly.
Because we didn't have that knowledge or that understanding. So I think that's probably one of the biggest things as an employer that's going to be hard for them. And I'm hoping that with your expertise in this, that you might have something that would help an employer to identify a designer drug or synthetic drug, whatever we're wanting to call them, compared to methamphetamine or something like that. What's the best way to help an employer be able to identify and know, we're dealing with a designer drug or a synthetic drug, or is it just that you're dealing with a stimulant? Just don't dismiss that it could be a designer drug as well.
Well, look, if a lot of times, I remember when I was a young cop before I got trained in drug impairment, I would look at somebody and go, are they crazy? High? Are they tired? Like, what's going on? Right?
Yeah.
And, we get training in the police academy on drug impairment and, in different drugs, but I mean, it wasn't enough. It was only 16 hours, which is kind of ridiculous when you think about it, right?
Yeah.
16 hours, you can't really learn a whole lot. But we're giving supervisors 2 hours and expecting them to keep the company safe. Look, man, that's not enough. What it comes down to is like you need drug impairment training. That's how you figure it out, right? Because you need to know the signs and symptoms of drug impairment, and not like, all right, like DOT, the supervisor training. Most of that's taken up by rules and regulations about what you can and can't do, and then you have an hour of alcohol, which everybody already knows alcohol for the most part. And then how much time does that leave for drugs? And then even with
Very
that, you
much.
don't give, yeah, nothing. And then you don't give them the time, that they need. You don't give them a system to determine drug impairment. And look, like when I do my classes, I teach a 7-step drug impairment method. And what a lot of these are. It's checking for a majority of them are eye signs. Well, you check for those eye signs, and you can see that there's impairment, and you send them away for reasonable suspicion testing, and they come back negative. Well, it's a synthetic drug. You weren't wrong. You were right. They're just using a drug to cheat the system.
They're masking it. Yep.
Exactly. And you just have to find out what drug that is. Now, look, when you're talking about one new drug coming out every week, you are not going to keep up with which drugs those are. So, example, the last 2 weeks, they were both opioids. That they're not fentanyl, but they are like fentanyl, right? There's nobody that's going to test for that. There's no test out for it yet. But somebody that's addicted to pain pills or addicted to opioids, and they don't want to come up positive, they're going to take one of those drugs because they know they're going to come up clean.
Mm-hmm.
And you're going to see that they're high. Look, how you tell they're under the influence of an opioid? They're going to have constricted pupils. Now, look, there's some medical causes for constricted pupils, but they're rare, and it usually only affects one pupil. It doesn't affect both, right?
Exactly.
So you got a guy sitting there standing, talking to you, and it's somewhat dark, and his pupils look like little pencil dots. Okay, that's more than likely that's going to be an opioid. That's the only, there's 8 drug categories, 7 if you take out alcohol. Okay. Every drug can go in a category. Right there, there's only one drug category that causes constricted pupils, and that's opioids. And so now that's what it is. So if you send them in for drug testing for reasonable suspicion, and it comes up negative because all you check for is heroin and you don't check for fentanyl, which boggles my mind,
Mine
because
as
there's
well.
more people. Yeah, there's more people doing fentanyl than heroin. So he comes up with a negative test. Well, now you would send it back and you would start checking for these synthetic opioids like fentanyl or methadone or something like that to see what they're going to come up positive for. And I mean, again, you were correct to send them off. It's just, look, the drug testing only tells you what drugs they used. It doesn't tell you what they're high on right now, right? So drug testing is going to show that they did drugs, but only the ones that you're checking for.
Yeah.
So you're letting the rest go away. Drug impairment training will show you to detect drug impairment right now. That drug test is just confirmation that you were correct. If it doesn't come back with anything, well, you're not testing for the right things, and you just send it back until it comes back positive for what you're looking for.
Well, and I think that's amazing, Keith, because I think you're probably in the same camp that I am. Is when I was a DRE and I was an officer, we were going out and doing our thing, mainly doing traffic stops, stuff like that. You may get called into a school once in a while. We hardly ever got called into a workplace to go and see somebody because they thought they were high. And I think a lot of that is like what you were just saying a minute ago. They didn't know what to look for. It
Yep.
wasn't obvious to them. And some of this stuff is going to be obvious when you've been trained. And we found that out when we started teaching school teachers and nurses
Hmm.
a system similar to the DRE program, and they started catching kids coming to school high. How hard do you think it's going to be? Because we're already in DOT safety sensitive positions. We're already giving them, like you talked about earlier, the 2-hour reasonable suspicion. And obviously, you and I are in the same agreement. It's just not enough. You're just barely touching
Yeah.
the basis of it. How hard do you think it's going to be to go to somebody like Dave, who's in a warehouse, that he's got 15 guys that he's responsible for on a third shift, and he's having accidents, and he has people that's coming to him and saying, hey, I think this guy's high. How hard is it going to be to take that training and that relevancy that we've had before and teach Dave, just your ordinary guy, how to detect this stuff in the workplace to cause his
Uh,
workplace to be safe?
so it's easy to train people, right? I'll give you an example. Both my kids are drug free. One's 23. He just got hired by a sheriff's department here in Idaho. And
Awesome.
I know, right? I'm so proud of him. And my daughter's going to university. She's in primary education. They are both open about what worked and what didn't work about teaching them about drugs. When they were in high school, when they were freshmen, it was mandatory that you had to come to my drug impairment training course, right? Because I want them to learn about drugs from me and
Yeah.
not from somebody else, right?
Yeah.
So my son went to the 8-hour and my daughter went to the full 24-hour course.
Wow.
My daughter was 14 and got certified as a drug abuse recognition specialist. She was the youngest in America to ever get certified.
Wow.
And she got one of the highest scores in class. And she identifies high people all the time when we walk down the street. Oh, that guy's high. He's on the stimulant. Oh, that guy, he's high. He's on a narcotic analgesic. My son, same way, right? My son got hit by a DUI driver. He got broadsided in Boise. And he recognized right away that she was impaired. And so he did, you remember what it's called. It's nystagmus, and it's where the cops on the side of the road, they move their finger back and forth across your eyes, and they're looking for jerkiness. And he's like, hey, do you mind looking at my finger here? Follow with your eyes. Keep your head still. And he sees nystagmus. So he looks in the car and he sees pill bottles everywhere. Well, Chuck, you and I both know that nystagmus is going to be seen in depressants, inhalants, and dissociative anesthetics. With pills laying around the car, it's a depressant drug, right?
Yep.
So my son, with 8 hours of training, was able, and he took that 5 years before the crash, was able to identify that she was under the influence of a depressant. When the cops showed up, and I'm going to burn him, my son's like, hey, she's DUI, drugs. And he's like, well, how do you know? Well, she's got nystagmus, and, there's pills down there, and there's no odor of alcohol. So, these are the drugs that cause nystagmus. And I can teach you nystagmus in 15 minutes. Okay. And the cop goes, oh, and he looks at my son's license and goes, Graves, hey, is your dad a DRE? And he goes, yes. Hey, I took his training class. My son's like, all right.
Yeah.
No, they didn't arrest her. They let her go.
Wow.
And which is disappointing because she needed to go to jail because she caused a DUI collision. But my point is, in 15 minutes, we can teach you nystagmus. If my 14-year-old daughter can do it and identify drug-impaired people, then Joe at the warehouse can learn how to do it. All we need is 4 hours. In 4 hours, we can give you and that would cover, your alcohol, be all DOT, cover all the DOT regulations. In 4 hours, you can train somebody to check for nystagmus and narrow it down to one of 4 drug categories. You can nail down, and you know how it is with nystagmus. We teach that jerkiness of the eyes going back and forth. You can actually tell what their BAC level is if it's alcohol only. And then you confirm that down, by looking at what the angle of onset and doing a mathematical formula, and it'll tell you what their BAC is. It's a great program. If I can teach you that in 15 minutes, bare bones, we're just going to teach you how to do it. You're well on your way to determining these, what it is they're in the influence of. Look, people are using drugs that are not on your panel. That's what they're going to use. That's why everybody's coming up clean. The only way you're going to catch those people is by doing a drug influence examination, by looking for drug impairment, and then narrowing it down to a category, and then testing for the drugs within that category. So, look, for people in the workplace want to know like all the time, how do I prove drug impairment? Well, cops have been doing it for 50 years. We've all the way up to the Supreme Court. We're rock solid. We have all the studies behind us to show it.
Isn't that amazing? And you've got probably copies of your reports. We've got the documentation. We have the lab results. We have all this evidence that what you're talking about right now is true and can be taught. So why isn't it?
Because it's funny. So I teach I teach drug impairment training to workplaces. My biggest customers, my biggest clients are outside of the United States. We're in Europe. We're in Australia, Asia. We're in Canada.
Why do you think those
and
guys
I have
are
just
calling
a
you
few.
more?
Well, I have just a few in the United States, and I tell you why is because it seems like people are afraid in America. And I don't know why they're afraid. Let me give you an example. Like when I start a drug impairment class, the very first picture I show is of a little girl on a bike. And I said, we're here for this little girl. And I'll never forget it. There was a guy that killed a little girl named Maddie. He was driving a work vehicle. He's subject to drug testing. And he crossed over the double yellow line and killed Maddie. She was a passenger in her mom's car. To tell you how screwed up this is, that was 25 years ago, and I remember it like it was yesterday. I arrested the guy for DUI drugs. He was using phenobarbital, and he was popping it like crazy. He was very high. One of the tests that we do, we have him estimate 30 seconds. At 90 seconds, I had to wake him up because he had fallen asleep. A normal pulse range is 60 to 90 beats per minute. So 60 is on the low end. He saw her decapitated, and his pulse was 50 beats a minute. To tell you how high this guy was, okay? What makes me mad is when somebody dies, we go 24 hours over the life of the person that caused the collision. So the first place I go is where he started at work driving the company vehicle. Everybody at work identified that this guy was impaired, that he looked like he was high. But they had sent him away for testing, and he came back clear. And they were all afraid because they didn't want to, keep having these bad tests come up, right? Well, they weren't bad tests. They weren't testing for the right thing. And the problem is nobody had the balls to stop this guy. Well, could training have saved Maddie's life? I think so. Absolutely. And I've seen that since then. I've had another case just like that where a guy killed a truck driver high on meth, killed a guy just going to work. And same thing, people at work should have known that guy was high and should have stopped him. So when you look at the lawsuits that came out of that, when I went and testified in the civil suits, what was the first thing I said? Absolutely, everybody at work should have known he was high. Look at this video of when I contacted him. He would have been worse when he was back at work.
Wow.
Right? And I burned him. And I burned him because it's the truth. I'm in court. I'm not going to lie. And I go back and like everybody should have known this guy was high, but they let him drive and now this person's dead. How much are they going to break out on that checkbook? It's just how many zeros are going to be at the end of that check that they're going to write.
Correct. So
when you talk about that training, 4 hours, you're talking about adding 2 hours more. Are you kidding me? And then, DOT's got to have some balls too. They got to come out and start checking for the right drugs. Like PCP, why is PCP on the panel? I mean, it is on the panel, right?
Yeah, it's still on the panel. And it amazes me as well. How many? Well, you were out in the San Francisco area, so you probably saw PCP a lot more than I ever did. Yeah. I never saw PCP influence until I was out in California. It's not a drug that's here in Colorado where I'm at, but it's state specific. You have certain places where you're going to have that use, but I agree with you. You're not going to see PCP in a DOT panel, and if you have, it's going to be very rare.
Look, let's put it this way: how many people are doing PCP compared to fentanyl?
Oh,
right.
Huge.
And here's the other thing. All right, so let's go back to synthetics for a minute. So let's say I do PCP, but I don't want to come back with a positive test. You do TCP. Mm-hmm. It's the letter T and then CP. It's an analog or a chemical cousin of PCP. But it is twice as potent as PCP. So I can get a more intense high and come back clean on all my drug tests. Well, why would I do PCP? It doesn't make sense, right? I mean, and look, all right. So my jury pool was Oakland and Berkeley, to give you the idea of where I was at. Okay, which is why I live in Idaho now. All right. So when you look at the people that I contact on a daily basis, the people that I encountered on PCP, I've got maybe 20 evaluations over a 29-year career.
Wow.
So 20 people high on PCP over 29 years. It's not it. I don't understand what they're doing. Look, synthetic drugs are taking over the market. Okay, 10% of people buy their drugs on the internet. Okay, they're not buying heroin and cocaine and meth. I mean, there might be a small fraction buying that, but they're buying, instead of LSD, they're buying N-bomb. It's the exact same thing. All right, LSD is a synthetic hallucinogen. You get high, you see pink elephants walking down the street. N-bomb is the same thing, but you're adding like some methamphetamine to it, right? And essentially it's the same type of high. Heroin. Everybody's going to fentanyl. It boggles my mind that we're not testing for fentanyl. But here's the thing, going back to drug impairment is the key, okay? Fentanyl influence is the same as heroin influence. It looks exactly the same, but fentanyl feels so much better. So why would I do heroin? I'm going to get arrested. I'm going to fail my drug tests. It's going to cause me all these problems, where I can go to fentanyl. And I've arrested people for being high on fentanyl at work. I can't tell you how many times I went into somebody's workplace, and this is how I got the idea to do all this stuff, is all the times I'm going to people's workplaces and hooking them up on warrants or whatever, or people high on drugs and killing people, driving company vehicles. I arrested one of my own city workers for being high driving a city vehicle. I mean, it's everywhere, right? And I remember when I so you know how it is I know exactly how it is in the workplace. We have a guy that's in the city I worked in. He was a department head. He is like chief of police, but for his department. I heard he was doing methamphetamine, and I heard he was drinking, and so I saw him driving a city vehicle. I pulled him over, pulled him out. He's got meth. He's drunk. He tested positive for cocaine on top of that.
Wow.
And everybody works like, oh my God, I can't believe that he did this. I'm like, really? Because I've had one encounter with him, and it's this stop right here. And how can you not tell that he's not high and drunk? You're choosing to ignore the signs and symptoms. Or, the other thing too is, I shouldn't say you're ignoring. Sometimes you just don't know.
Do you think it's hard for people to even comprehend that somebody would come to work like that? I think that's part of it, is that they think that the way that you were brought up, that you're going to have some ethics when you come to work, that you're there to do a job, I'm paying you to do a job. I think that's probably one of those things that these guys they can't comprehend, that somebody would even come to work like that.
Yes. Yeah. I'll never forget, like, I shouldn't be so harsh about not noticing, right? Well, I'll give you an example. I made a car stop when I was a brand new cop. I was still on probation. I didn't know what I was doing. I saw this guy. He looked bad, so I pulled him over, but I don't know what to do. I mean, I'm brand new, right? And I made contact with him, and I look at him, and I'm like, something's wrong with this guy. Is he high? Is he crazy? Is he drunk? So I take him out of the car, and next thing I know, 4 undercover cars roll up, and they all jump out. It's DEA. They're following this guy. And they're like, hey, have you found anything yet? Nope, but I'm still looking. I had no idea what. I'm like, well, I guess I should go search this guy's car and go look at everything, right? Yeah. So I searched the car, find just a huge amount of drugs that to this day I still haven't found as much, and totally I went in this blind. I don't know if I would have searched this car before DEA showed up. I didn't know what I was doing, and so the DEA agent goes, well, he's high too. You're going to do it for DUI? Yes. Why, yes, I am. I am going to arrest him for being high. I didn't know he was high. I couldn't tell what was going on. I called my sergeant up, and I'm like, I think this guy's high, but I don't know what I'm supposed to do. And the best thing from the sergeant is like, I don't know either. What do you think we should do? I don't know, dude, but you got 15 years on. I've only been here for a month, so I need somebody to hold my hand. So our supervisors, were sending them out there with 2 hours of training. I had 16. Okay. Yeah. Now, I was 21 years old. Okay. The only life experience I had was the Army. Yeah. We're sending these supervisors out and having to make these decisions to keep the company safe and free from liability, it's not going to work. You know, you need to give them 4 hours of training at a minimum. Really, it should be 8, but 4 hours. You know, what on a settlement for one company that I hammered in court was that they had they asked me in court, what do you think they should have? And I said they should have 8 hours of drug training. And then that's what they stipulated in court, is that every supervisor had to have 8 hours of training.
Wow.
And they paid a lot of zeros at the end of that check and had to do the 8 hours of training. So what's better off, doing the 8 hours, 4 hours or 8 hours?
Yeah.
Or is it, what do you want to do? And look, it's going to cost a lot of money. This training's not cheap. There's not many people doing it. But we know everybody's doing drugs other than what you're testing for. All right? So depressant pills. Let's say you're checking for Xanax in your company, in which I hope people are checking for Xanax, because that's one of the number one depressant drugs that people are abusing right now. So let's say your company tests for Xanax. Well, shit, I use Xanax. Oh, sorry, now you have to put the explicit tag on there.
You're all right,
so
man.
shoot, I test for, my company tests for Xanax. I'm going to use Edazolam, Flubromazole, or Clonazepam, which is total synthetic drugs that just came out in the last year that nobody's testing for, but I can get high just like if I was on Xanax. And the best part is they aren't illegal. Yeah. So I can order them on the open web. I can have them delivered to my house. I can get high, give a pee test, and still come back clean. So there's no risk of arrest. I can get a stronger high. Why wouldn't you switch? Yeah. If you're using heroin, we know fentanyl, right? Yep. So let's say you test for fentanyl. Awesome. I'm going to switch to U-47-700. U-47-700 has a slang name called pink. It's already killed like 60 people in the United States. So the DEA put it in Schedule 1. The very next day came out U-48-800. When that got outlawed, then it was U-49-900. Now they're at U-10235.
Wow. So they just keep resyndicating the whole thing and coming out with a different formulation to keep ahead of everybody else is what they're actually doing.
That's correct. All they have to do is, because our Controlled Substance Act is so antiquated, all I got to do is change the molecular structure slightly, and now it's legal. Now, it may fall under the analog law, but nobody's prosecuting that, so you're clear, right?
Yeah.
So nothing's going to happen. There's no risk, and I'm going to come up clean on my test for whether it's court mandated, whether it's work related. It doesn't matter what it is. It was funny on 9/11. I got sent to. I was on a SWAT team, and I got sent to a government facility that does nuclear weapons research. And you got to have a top secret clearance or above to work there. And when we were out there, we thought we didn't know what was going on. And so I'm standing out there in my SWAT uniform outside the SWAT vehicle, and the workers are going home now. And I remember seeing 3 guys coming out, and they were high. So I stopped them, and we had nothing going on. And so I started jacking them up, like, hey, you guys are high. You're coming out of work. You work in a government facility. Come have a seat. And they were all high on a stimulant. And so I called the internal security force for that place, and nobody had an idea what to do. And I'm like, well, don't you have drug testing? I mean, I can arrest them. Yeah, could you arrest them and just send us the report? I'm like, okay, I can do that. But planes are crashing into buildings. Why don't you guys just send them in for drug testing and fire them? Yeah. But people didn't know what to do. And how long have they been working in this government facility? When they have they have mandated drug testing there. But, and I remember conversing with these guys, and they were saying, yeah, we use, I can't remember what drug they were using, but they were using another drug that just doesn't come up positive.
Wow. And I think that's the most important thing that we've been talking about, is that this could be easily remedied just by giving some training. Yeah, it's going to take time. Yes. It's going to take a little bit of money. But is that investment that you're making in that supervisor, that owner of the company, what's the payoff in the end? It may help that owner of that company be able to still have a company and not lose everything that
Yes.
they've worked for overnight. Like you and I are both entrepreneurs now. We have our own businesses,
Yep.
employees, stuff like that. So we understand that. I mean, even with the business that I have, I still have people come in here to be a technician, and they're like, "So I have to pass a drug test?" I'm like, "Yeah, that's what we do." So that even amazes me. But I think the other thing too is like I talked about in my last episode on clearing the haze is how important our policies and procedures are, and a lot of these guys don't even know what it is that they can do. You know,
Well,
so
and the other thing with training too is it's got to be ongoing, right? I think that every year you should get an update. Now that update doesn't have to
refresher
be,
training or something.
yeah, it doesn't have to be a year. It could be honest or not a year, but it doesn't have to be, 4 hours of training. The update training every year could just be an hour and it could be online. And it's like, these are the latest drug trends. These are the drugs that people are using. Or, yeah, one of the things that I love doing is I would give talks in the community to parents about how to recognize if your kid's using drugs. It was a drug impairment for parents. And I would always bring in a drug dealer that was 18 years old.
Wow.
And he would come in and talk, and it was part of their, because, they got to do community service, and that would be their community service. And they would come in and talk about how they dealt drugs to all their kids and how they would hide it, use it, the drugs that they were using. And it was, and I always had them talk for about a half an hour, and just the look on people's faces. And I remember I was doing a workplace uh, education one time. It was the 4-hour drug impairment class.
Hmm.
And while I was talking, there was one guy in the back, one supervisor, just affirming everything I said. He just made a point of like, he's right, he's right. And I was like, man, he's kind of going overboard on the he's right. So at break, I'm like, hey man, it sounds like you got some experience. He's like, I used to get high in this office every day. He goes, they realized I was doing drugs. They sent him off to drug rehab. He came back. Now he's evangelical about, stopping drug use in the workplace. And he came up and talked about all the places he would do drugs at that workplace.
Wow.
And he would talk about smoking meth in the supervisor's office, or, these different places. And as he's talking, I'm thinking like, how did you guys not notice this? I mean, he was telling me he was doing drugs for 2 years before anybody confronted him.
Wow.
And how can you not know? It's drug impairment. It's like your kids. You don't want to admit that your kids are doing drugs, right? And you notice that there's something wrong with them, and you want to say something, but you still want to have a relationship with them, or whatever excuse is in your head. But we do this drug impairment training for parents, and they immediately go home, confront their kids, and our call volume will increase slightly as like these parents go home and start calling on their kids because they've now found drugs or what have you.
Yeah. So
So,
so we know
what
it's
would happen in a
effective.
workplace, right?
Very true. Well, Keith, I want to wrap this up with you. I know that we said 30 minutes and we're already over that time, and I appreciate your time and your willingness to come out with us today. But I have just a couple things I'd like to ask. First of all, if people are wanting to get a hold of you, what's the best way to get a hold of you, and put a plug in for your company and how they can get a hold of you on training issues, or if they want further information on synthetic drugs and those things that you offer training in.
So the best thing you can do is go to my website, gravesassociates.com, GRAVES Associates, all one word.com. If you go there, there'll be a pop-up that'll say if you want to sign up for the drug training bulletin, or drug intelligence bulletin, sign up for it. I send information out every 2 weeks about current drug trends. Not going to spam you or anything like that. It's just what the current drug trends are. Um, On my website, you can get contacts from my social media. You can email me. You can do whatever you need to do for training that we offer. It's all there. You can also see our online training. You can go to onlinetraining.gravesassociates.com and see our online stuff as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Keith. And one last question that I want to ask you. Every one of us is entrepreneurs, business leaders, or each one of us, I find that we are continually educating ourselves. We're continually reading. We're continually doing things. So I'm just asking you a question out of curiosity. What is it that Keith Graves is reading right now that you would recommend to somebody else and say this book will change your life or the way you look at things? What book would that be?
So right now, I read a professional book, and then I read for pleasure. Right now, I'm reading Acts in the Bible.
Okay.
but okay,
Ain't
but
nothing wrong with
outside of
that.
that, but I got to tell you, the best thing that I'm doing right now is I'm following. I follow several different drug bulletins that come out. So they could be like right now I belong to a private one where it's actually I got onto it. It's all toxicologists and they're talking about all the vaping trends and why people are dying from vaping. And
Wow.
where it's coming from is it's oil building up in their lungs. It's, so they inhale it, the oil cools, solidifies in their lungs, and then they suffocate and die.
Wow.
And so I'm getting more out of those little groups for my reading right now. That's where I'm getting my most information, is
Wow.
those little groups. So if you go to like Drug Free America, you go to my drug training bulletin, all these little bulletins that come out, you might get like 5 in a week. If you just take a half an hour to read through those, you'll get the most information you ever need about drugs and drug trends.
Wow, that's incredible. That's a good one. I'll have to look at that one. But yeah, the vaping, that in and of itself is going to be another podcast episode, I'm thinking too. So,
Yes, it is.
hey Keith, I want to thank you for your time. I appreciate it, and I know our listeners do as well. A lot of good information, and drug testing in today's workplace is something that's just going to continue to happen. Education, teaching people how to protect themselves, their employees, and their clients' community is something that's just going to be an ongoing thing. And I appreciate everything that you're doing. You're doing the same thing that we are, trying to make a difference and trying to help those out there that are they're trying to accomplish the same thing, and that's to make sure that we're all safe. So, just want to thank you for that, and thank you for tuning in to this episode of Clearing the Haze. And we'll look forward to talking to you next time. Thanks.